Keywords are the bolded words that almost every card in the game has, and is usually the short form for a fairly common effect. And while Blizzard has printed over 40 keywords in the 8 years Hearthstone's been playable for, that doesn't mean all of them are created equal. So in this video, we'll be looking at how good certain keywords are, instead of how good the cards that have them are. And at number 10, we have Mega Wind Fury. This keyword lets a minion with it attack up to 4 times in a single turn, and, fun fact, has never been printed on a single collectible minion in Hearthstone. So why is this keyword on it when you can't even put a minion with it in your deck? Well, that's because it could easily be the best keyword in the game if printed on the wrong card, which is why Blizzard has been so strict with its distribution. In fact, the only way you can even summon a minion with Mega Wind Fury on ladder is by using either Whirlwind Tempest or Mimiron's Head, which are both not very good to say the least. Whirlwind Tempest, in addition to being expensive and overstanded, requires you to keep a couple friendly Wind Fury minions alive, which is basically impossible considering they are all understated and must kill targets for your opponent. On the other hand, Mimiron's Head, another understated minion with a condition that's basically impossible to pull off, spoiler alert, actually made it into our #1 spot on our list for the most difficult win conditions to build around. And while I won't go into too many specifics, the combo that Mimiron's Head relies on to summon Voltron is too fragile and basically a pipe dream to ever get off in a competitive game. So why is Mega Wind Fury on this list at all? Well, that's because I think it's the most expensive keyword out there that could be printed in very specific circumstances. I'm sure Blizzard is well aware of the supremely degenerate strategies Mega Wind Fury could potentially lend itself to, especially considering that any attack buff suddenly gets quadrupled. And while Mega Wind Fury probably was meant as a joke, the fact that it's a bolded keyword does mean that it counts for this list. And while neither of the 2 Mega Wind Fury cards ever saw competitive play, their keyword was so inherently broken that they had to be designed bad. Even still, I think the keyword itself is valued at about 10 mana honestly, considering it would still be vulnerable to taunt minions removal and the cost to even get it out. Maybe one day Blizzard could print a 10 mana 2/2 with Mega Wind Fury, but I'm sure somebody out there can find a way to make it into an OTK. And because it was one of the highest base costs and simultaneously worst distributions on actual cards, Mega Wind Fury manages to barely make it onto this list. And at number 9, we have Discover. This unique Hearthstone keyword presents you with a random 3 choices from whatever specific pool of cards was referenced and lets you pick one, usually to add to your hand. This mechanic was first introduced in the League of Explorers expansion as a one-off keyword, but ended up being so popular with the fanbase that Blizzard has continued to print cards with it to this day. It's been said before, but Blizzard really did do a good job with Discover since it perfectly takes advantage of the online medium by offering randomly selected cards from uncollected sets, or even copies of cards from your deck. In nearly every case, being able to discover an option, rather than randomly generating one, makes a card much better, since you can always pick the option that best suits your situation. In fact, this part of the mechanic has been so good that Blizzard has even reused the exact same 3-option discovery option window for some of their other keywords. Some of the best examples of this were Shadow Visions, which lets you selectively pick a spell from your deck, and the infamous Primordial Glyph, which basically was a 0-mana card that generated a spell. In other cases, Discover just gives you more options, like in the case of Eternal Servitude. This card, despite costing twice as much as Resurrect, actually helped revive Big Priest from being a dead deck in Wild because it ensured you could always pick the best minion for your situation from your res pool and would never whiff during your important swing turns. So, if I've been talking so highly of Discover, why isn't it higher on this list? Well, with popularity comes with it a ton of mediocre cards, most of which have been filling Blizzard's pack fillers for the past 5 years. Even still, most of them have managed to still have some competitive niches. But again, the keyword has to be dragged down by the sheer number of bad Discover cards out there. If the Discover keyword had to be given a mana cost, I'd price the effect of randomly generating a card and drawing a card from your deck anywhere from 0 to 1 mana. Blizzard has also very clearly recognized this, as proved by the 38 different variations of a 1-mana Discover a Card spells that have been printed over the years. But if you ever need a cheap option, a value option, or just a flat-out desperation play, you can probably find something you need from a Discover card that even your deck may not have. And at number 8, we have Freeze. This mechanic forces the affected character to skip their next attack, and usually skips that character's next attack phase. This keyword was a complete nuisance in early Hearthstone because just about every deck at the time was completely board-centric, and relied on minions to win games for them. And even though the freeze mechanic doesn't stop minions from taking combat damage, the fact that a well-timed freeze on a big minion or a board wipe freeze could completely brick some decks out of playing for a turn made it one of the most hated keywords on release. It almost always encouraged freeze players to run stally decks while limiting the number of options your opponent had. That being said, the only real meta-relevant freeze card for a long time was Frost Nova, a card which only froze all of your opponent's minions and could be comboed with Doomsayer for a near unstoppable 5-mana board clear. Keen viewers may have noticed that I mentioned that freeze usually skips a character's next attack earlier on, and while it would ordinarily freeze them for a full turn, since your opponent will usually have attacked with all their minions, if they choose to just not attack, then their minion can immediately unfreeze after their turn ends. And because people figured out that you can choose a mechanic to only freeze your opponent's minions on the following turn, Freeze Shaman has actually been a tier 1 deck in Wild off of the back of Snowfall Guardian. And while the base freeze mechanic has been a helpful tech option in the past, particularly against decks which attacked with their heroes a lot, the reason this mechanic is so low on this list is because some of the cards that freeze keyword has been attached to have just been insanely good. For example, Frostbolt, Ice Lance, and Ray of Frost have seen a ton of play in Mage, but it was mostly because of their abilities to deal direct damage or function in combo decks. Windchill and Windpaw Cavern have also been great, but that's because they should really cost 1 to 2 mana more than they do right now. If I had to put a price on this mechanic, I'd say the board freezes should cost 3 mana, and single freezes should cost 0 mana, yet Blizzard has printed multiple cards over the years that completely blow past these estimates. So I don't even know anymore. I'm sure Blizzard had continued to print early Hearthstone-like freeze cards, it wouldn't have even made it on this list. But because of the sheer strength of a lot of the more recent inclusions, I had to put freeze at the number 8 spot on this list. And at number 7, we have Battle Cry. This keyword lets the card it's attached to activate the text specified after the battle cry when it's played from your hand. If Discovered is the bread of Hearthstone, Battle Cry is the butter. You see, if you want a minion, weapon, or hero card to have any sort of effect when played from your hand in Hearthstone, it almost always has to be attached to a Battle Cry. It doesn't matter if your Battle Cry is conditional, game-winning, or so weird you have no other way to explain it. If you want to do something when it hits the board, it's going to have a Battle Cry. And since minions make up a vast majority of the types of cards in Hearthstone, it's no wonder that you can see battle cries on just about every minion out there. That being said, battle cries are still quite limited, since they only activate when you play them from your hand, and not when they get randomly summoned or resurrected. Some of the most broken, overplayed, and format-defining cards in the entire game have had battle cries, including beasts like Blood Reaver Gul'dan, Shutterwalk, Reno Jackson, Wildheart Guff, Grey Sage Parrot, Swordfish, Loatheb. These cards have featured and carried so many tier 1 decks over the years to the point where it's almost impossible to find any decks that don't contain at least a couple Battlecry minions. And because they're so prevalent, any cards which can benefit Battlecry minions or stop them from being played at all have actually seen a ton of competitive success, even in Wild. So if so many amazing cards have battle cries, why is it so high on this list? Well, that's because I didn't tell you that there are over 1,200 cards as battle cry in the game, and I only picked the really good ones. As you'd expect, most are pretty average and some are terrible. In reality, battle cries shouldn't cost anything, and entirely depends on the cost of the effect that it's attached to. Besides, the Hearthstone has long since passed when immediate effects had to be taxed more than delayed effects, and is seen now as the norm for most cards. But because of the sheer impact that really good Battlecry minions have had on the game, despite being a very cheap keyword, I'd say it's just enough to carry the entire setup to the number 7 spot on this list. And at number 6, we have Tradable. This fairly new keyword gives you the option to shuffle the card back into your deck and draw a new one for 1 mana or play the card normally. And as a side note, once you play a tradable card, it basically functions as a normal card since it only works while it's in your hand. For those of you who don't really play Hearthstone, drawing cards is pretty valuable, and is usually worth about 1.5 mana to draw a specific type of card from your deck. 1 mana cards which let you cycle through your deck, like Cobalt Librarian, Powerword Shield, and Crimson Sigil Runner, have historically been very good, since it lets you go through your 30 card deck very quickly to find the cards you actually need. And while these cards also have a slight bonus attached to them, 1 mana cycle cards have even been playable with no other effects attached to them. So as you can probably see by now, the fact that all tradable cards give you the option to draw a card from your deck for just 1 mana already makes them comparable to some of the best cards of the game, and adds a ton of consistency to just about every deck. And even though you do have the chance to immediately redraw the tradable card you just shuffled away, the extra flexibility and deal you get with the tradable is just insane. This is probably the best normal keyword in the game right now, since even though there haven't been any nerfs in this category, they're considered to be very strong cards in both Standard and Wild. Tradable cards like Shard of the Naru, Blackwater Cutlass, Fire Sail have seen a ton of play in Wild and Standard because they're all great anti-aggro tools that also help very fast combo decks cycle towards the cards they need. But probably the biggest reason why these cards are so high on this list is because Blizzard, for whatever reason, printed tradable cards on a ton of tech cards, which are highly situational cards which benefit from it the most. In fact, some tier 1 decks in Standard and Wild will have included either otherwise useless tradable cards just so they can trade them and draw even faster through their deck. So, how much does it cost? Surprisingly, Blizzard made it cost virtually nothing to print as an extra keyword, since Royal Librarian was printed as a straight up better version of Spellbreaker. And in my opinion, tradable cards should be taxed by an extra 0.5 mana to 1 mana worth of stats, for quite literally never being a dead card in any matchup. It just doesn't really make sense to me as to why they printed competitively viable standalone cards, and then also gave them one of the best splashable keywords in the entire game. And at number 5, we have Immune. This keyword is pretty self-explanatory. The target can't be targeted or damaged by your opponent, but can by friendly targets. This placement may surprise a lot of newer players. After all, what could be better than literally making a character immune? Unfortunately, the immune keyword has had some challenges to make it less overwhelmingly powerful, like making immune targets vulnerable to non-targeting destruction effects and to targeted enchantments. At this point in the list, we're starting to get to keywords which are really powerful and either need restrictions or nerfs, and immune is a perfect example of that. Obviously, no card game can realistically make any character permanently immune. So Blizzard has either made immune effects temporary, make some other characters immune, or attached to weapons. Historically, immune cards have never really been a problem because of its extremely limited distribution and fact that it's often temporary. Despite that though, immune effects on the right cards have proved to be extremely powerful due to the base strength of the keyword. Late game cards like Raid Boss Onyxia and Mal'Ganis have proven to be extremely powerful cards in Wild, and can often single-handedly win games off of the value that their immune effects provide. Even in Standard, where immune has been largely restricted to slightly better versions of Divine Shield, tempo decks have abused immune to easily take board control and never let go of it. By far, the most broken card immune has ever been printed on has been Ice Block, which is probably most players' first encounter with the keyword. This card prevents any lethal damage you would have taken on your opponent's turn and makes your hero immune until the start of your turn. And barring any secret hate cards, Ice Block basically guaranteed that you couldn't lose to any unexpected burst damage, as insane as it sounds. For just 3 mana, you basically gained a free turn, where you could do whatever you wanted while knowing that Ice Block would save you. To this day, I'm still pretty shocked by the number of cards that have immune, though nowadays it's always tied to some sort of temporary condition. As for the cost of immune, I don't think any amount of mana could make permanent immune fair, but if it's limited in such a way so that your opponent can remove it on their turn, then it could be priced at just over 1 mana. And at number 4, we have Charge. This old school keyword allows minions with it to attack any enemy immediately after being summoned, and basically skips their first turn of summoning sickness. While it may seem like having a keyword to attack like a normal minion may not seem like a big deal, Charge has always historically been an extremely problematic keyword. You see, in Hearthstone, other than secrets and taunt minions, there are very, very few ways to interact with your opponent's minions on their turn. The whole game was built around you having a full turn where you could respond to your opponent's minions before it was allowed to attack, and Charge just skips right over this rule. You see, the reason why Charge is significantly higher on this list than Freeze is because while Freeze can potentially prevent you from getting killed, Charge minions can just straight up kill your opponent with no thought involved. A phrase you might hear in the Hearthstone community is fun and interactive, which originated because Charge minions were exactly the opposite to face. Not only could Charge minions deal a huge chunk of damage to your hero, they also had the potential to trade into one of your minions while still leaving a body that you had to deal with. As for meta-relevant cards, well, there's a lot of them. Sky Captain Crag, Mr. Smite, Kor'kron Elite, Chillblade Champion, Kaya Sunfury, Arcane Golem, Southsea Deckhand, Argent Horse Rider, and even Wolf Rider, all basically had minimal text and the same job: hit your opponent in the face and stay on board for as long as possible. And for as simple as these cards look and are, they've all been significant cards to the Standard and Wild meta at some point. In fact, barring immunity, I don't think a single other keyword could have replaced Charge on these cards and still made them meta-relevant. Some of the worst offenders in this category include Leroy Jenkins, who was a Hall of Famed, nerfed, and is an aggro staple in Wild, Patches the Pirate, who was nerfed and still an aggro staple in Wild, and Warsong Commander, who was hit with one of the most brutal nerfs of all time. And if I had to price the cost of adding Charge to a card, it would definitely have to depend on the amount of attack it has, or at a base cost of 2 mana. The fact that these Charge minions can basically get a free damage spell, while still being a threat on board, have pushed a lot of aggro decks to be the best decks of the game at some point, which is why Charge definitely deserves to be the top 5 on this list, and should probably never be printed again. And at number 3, we have Recruit. This keyword lets you directly summon a random minion from your deck, or pulls them as Hearthstone players say. If you played any card games before, you probably can guess why this mechanic is so high up on this list. For one, other than the base cost of the card, with Recruit you don't have to pay any extra mana for the specified minion or to even have it in your hand. Take Call to Arms for example. This 4 mana spell lets you recruit 3 minions from your deck that cost 2 or less mana, and can very easily be built around only pulling minions that cost 3 mana. And while you may argue that having to build around these recruit cards is just another cost for its payoff, it's kind of insane to see how much mana recruit cards were designed to cheat out. In fact, this isn't even the most disgusting example, since Possessed Lackey used to be able to cheat out 9 mana Void Lords for just 6 mana. Even today in Wild, Oaken Summons is still considered one of the best cards in the game, since you can build your deck around it to pull out Archmage Vargoth, who will recast Oaken Summons to pull out a full health injured Marauder, or an effective 4 mana 6/16 with added bonuses. And while there aren't too many cards out there that actually have the recruit keyword, a lot of them have the exact same mechanic but written out in their card text. Old Yashiraj basically casted Gather Your Party at the end of your turns. Mysterious Challenger basically recruited 5 unique secrets from your deck, and Patches the Pirate basically recruited himself the first time he played a pirate. And at some point in the game's history, all 3 of these monsters have been core cards in the best decks in their formats. I can't even think of a single other keyword that allows for such unfair board swings and gets more and more powerful with each new expansion. And while it isn't as necessarily game-breaking as it is in other games, the fact that you can summon specific minions from your deck without ever having to draw them, while thinning your deck, is just insane value from one keyword. Again, this keyword should be priced in accordance to the cards that it's pulling, but because it does so much, it should have to cost at least as much as the minion it's pulling. Recruit definitely deserves to be at the number 3 spot on this list, considering it has by far the easiest potential to gain a huge mana advantage off of it, and completely snowball a game out of control. And at number 2, we have Start of the Game. This keyword simply activates the card's specific text at the start of each game and doesn't require you to draw it or pay its mana cost to activate. As long as it's in your deck and its conditions are met, start of game effects will always trigger, and, well, are pretty insane. While the effects on most of the start of the game cards may not seem too great, the fact that they basically cost nothing to include while giving you a significant advantage at the start of the game has made them some of the most game-changing cards in the game. It's hard to overstate how much of an impact they've had on the game, especially since they basically changed the starting rules of Hearthstone and usually only require you to slightly change the cards used during deck building. This keyword has by far the highest portion of good cards in it, and most of them still see a generous amount to play, even in Wild today. The first of these cards was Baku and Gen, who modified your hero power at the start of the game if you only included odd or even cost cards in your deck, and were so good they actually forced Blizzard to create the Hall of Fame set, which was Hearthstone's version of a ban list. At the time, pretty much every single deck in the meta was either an odd or even deck, whether it was even Totem Shaman, odd aggro Rogue, even Hand Warlock, or odd aggro Demon Hunter. And with the introduction of Archbishop Benedictus, which catapulted aggro Shadow Priest as a tier 1 deck in Wild and Standard, Cthulhu the Shattered, which became Druid's single best win condition in Wild, and Prince Renathal, who was already making it to tier 1 decks in Wild, the start of game keyword has never looked better. Another reason for the dominance could be the sheer consistency these decks had. A surprising number of the best competitive decks can still flop super hard if they don't get specific cards they need at the right time. And while normal decks spend the whole game hoping to draw their one specific win condition, or one of legendary that'll win them the game, start of game cards ensure that they'll never have to worry about that. So, how much should the start of game keyword cost? Well, it's pretty tricky since all of the start game effects are free, so they have to impose some sort of other cost to offset the mana advantage they generate at the start of the game. If I had to say, I'd probably make the net effect cost 0 mana, since starting the game off with even just a 1 mana advantage, like in the case of Baku, Gen, and Benedictus, can already lead to insane decks. And other than the next keyword on this list, no other keyword in the game can provide the amount of value and deck synergy that the start of game effects can provide. And at number 1, we have Quest and Questline. These are special types of spells that always start in your opening hand before the game starts that you can choose to keep or shuffle back into your deck during the mulligan stage. Then, once played, it permanently stays on the field and will reward you once you finish its specific requirement. And yes, before you mention it, Quest and Questlines are technically 2 different keywords, but because they function so similarly, I've grouped them together here at the number 1 spot. The only difference between them is that Questlines are in a sequence of 3 mini-quests that end with the final reward, while Quests just have one set of requirements and a reward. In short, no other keyword in the game comes even close to the number of nerfed, Hall of Famed, or otherwise banned cards that have been printed. In fact, we made a video on just those quests, and not every quest deck that's been good at some point. I'm sure we could easily clear an hour in length. So just as a quick preview, we'll go over some of the most overpowered quests in chronological order. Starting with the first batch printed in Journey to Ungoro, we have OG Quest Warrior, which was tier 1 in Standard, Caverns Rogue, a nearly S tier deck in Standard that had to be nerfed twice in 1 year, and Waygate Mage, which was an S tier deck in Wild and was nerfed, still remained an S tier deck, and is currently the best deck in Wild right now. In the second batch of quests printed for Saviors of Uldum, Blizzard tried to make them slightly weaker, but ended up printing New Quest Druid, which was a tier 1 deck in Standard, and New Quest Shaman, which currently is a tier 1 deck in Wild. And finally, with the release of questlines for United and Stormwind, Blizzard somehow printed quest cards which were somehow even more powerful than the first batch. In Standard, questline Shaman, Rogue, Druid, Mage, and Demon Hunter were all tier 1 decks at one point, while questline Hunter, Warrior, and Warlock all dominated in Wild as tier 1 decks, even after getting nerfed several times. And as much as I hate to talk about it again, the Warlock questline, the Demon Seed, has been the second card to have ever been straight up banned from Wild for being too overwhelmingly dominant. In retrospect, while there are a decent number of bad quests out there, because you know that all your deck has to do is complete the quest reward, it makes every quest deck extremely consistent and synergistic. And in a game with 30 card decks and synergy being king above all else, good quest decks are really hard to compete with, which is why quests deserve to be called the #1 best keyword in Hearthstone. Alright, and that's the list. If you have any ideas that you'd like to see turned into videos, or notice anything that we missed, be sure to leave those down in the comments below.